Okay, so today we are going to talk about cannabis. And as I think I mentioned in class, I recorded this back, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, put it on YouTube, and they promptly took it down because I was playing uh, Bob Dylan at the very beginning. So I'm not playing any musical clips from popular music because they will take it down for copyright infringement. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is at certain points I'm going to ask you to stop this recording and listen to something. I'll probably read the lyrics or talk about the song, and then it's just stop it, and since you're on YouTube, just put that into YouTube in the search box and look for it and listen, and we'll have a much fuller experience. You know, I can't take those things and put them in this, or they will take it down. So having said that, let me give you the experience of offering this lecture, because when I started, cannabis was illegal in not just the United States, but in the state of California and everywhere in the United States, every state. None of the legislation had passed yet when I first started, but when I started it, I had a speaking engagement at the Amsterdam Food History Symposium, the first one actually. I was keynoting that, which was rather exciting. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go to Amsterdam. Let's give it a shot. And I have to admit, I have very little experience of cannabis in my lifetime. You know, I suppose a few times when I was younger and a few times as an adult, but really very little experience on the whole, despite my tie-dye, which I made, both of these. But, and I know I look like an aging hippie now, but still. So I thought, let me get experience just because I'm teaching this class, and it was in the fall semester, right when I was teaching it, and I was going over Thanksgiving, I think. And so anyway, Amsterdam is one of those very strange places where things like drugs and prostitution are legal. And the insight that I got from that whole trip, interestingly, was that the Dutch are willing to sell you anything, as they were spices in the past, or tulips at a ridiculous price in the 17th century. They don't do them themselves. They sell them to others. And, you know, my experience was that the coffee shops, as they're called in Amsterdam, are largely filled with American tourists, all over the place, wandering through the streets, completely stoned out of their minds. So I figured, I need to do this. It's legal here. It was not legal anywhere in the US at the time. And so I went into one of these shops, which was fairly crowded, kind of reggae playing, Bob Marley. The place was painted with Rasta images. It looked like the right place to go. And I got online, and they have a big sort of case there. I have no experience of this in my life. And there was this African-American couple, a little older than me actually, maybe about 60 or so, standing in front of me online ordering. And I thought, let me listen closely, because I don't know, I assumed they would know what they were doing, but anyone would have known more than me. So they start buying some cupcake-like things. These are edibles before they ever were in the US, and some pre-rolled joints that had like hashish in them or something. And I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. I'm not doing this half-assed. I want to do it completely, okay? And so they get their stuff. I order one of these big fat stogie-like things. And I go into the back part of the shop, and people are like sitting on high stools and just chilling out, listening to the music. And I lit this thing up and started smoking it. And nothing happened, of course, immediately. And then I look over, and that African-American couple were sitting next to me with a pair of their friends. And all of a sudden, I hear thud, like the loudest bang. The other guy, had fallen backwards, flat out onto his back, and was out cold. And the person who was standing in line in front of me started smacking his face. Sorry, wake up. I can't remember the guy's name now, but it was just like smacking him, and he wouldn't wake up. And I thought, uh-oh, this is not going very well. And the manager came in and said, you can't lay on the floor, and the guy was out cold. And so they picked him up, brought him out into the street, brought him a glass of water. I don't think they just tossed him in the street, but it was like, I was thinking, holy shit, they're doing the same thing I'm doing now. Should I get out of here? So I by that point, I was almost done with this one joint, and I said, let me just get out of here. I don't want to hang around or do more. I have no idea what's going to happen. And so I walked out. I had to step over this guy who'd fallen out. You know, he was just sort of half sprawled on the staircase. And then I just said, okay, let me just get back to my hotel. This is, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. So let me go there. And I start walking. And, you know, this is along the canals. It must have been about 5, 6 o'clock. I don't know. And I'm walking, and like, I don't know, hours go by. And that's not unusual for me. I like to walk a lot, so that didn't bother me. What bothered me is, A, I didn't have a map. B, for some reason, I left my phone back in the hotel, so I couldn't even, and I didn't even remember the name of the hotel that I was walking there. And I just start walking, and I said, oh shit, I am lost. Where am I going to go? And there, you know, I don't even remember the name of the place. How am I going to do this? And I started panicking and thinking, you know, oh, I can just wander around this city for hours, but I'll find it eventually. I don't know. And at that very second, I turned to my left. There was the door to the hotel. 10 minutes had passed. I mean, it was just completely ridiculous what had happened. And I just went up into my room, laid there, and the room spinned and the colors flashed all over the place. It was very strong stuff. And I don't know whether it was a pleasant experience. Actually, it wasn't in the end. Even apart from getting lost, I was just laying down in bed. But, you know, after this all happened in the morning, I was like, did I really want to know about that? Did I need to do that? And the answer, of course, is no. Now, since that happened, the medical marijuana bill passed in California, and you could, with a, you know, doctor's note, buy it. And there were a few dispensaries in California. Then Colorado made it legal. And what was really strange is I was in Colorado at that moment, and I thought, okay, let me find it here. Maybe I can specify the strain or get something better. I don't know. I couldn't find it anywhere when it was legal. And in fact, I went to one restaurant specifically because I knew they had cannabis in the desserts, in the menu. I think it was called The Kitchen, in fact. And I was there, and they said, oh, our pastry chef just left to start her own edibles business. And I was like, oh, damn. And I found out about a week later that Kim Severson, who writes for the New York Times, was in that restaurant the very same night, had the exact same experience, that they didn't have it there. So anyway, flash forward to 2016, and the California passes legislation, so it's legal for recreational marijuana in the state, but it's not legal in the county, in San Joaquin County, and it wasn't legal in Stockton, hadn't passed it yet either. So there were no dispensaries for recreational marijuana, and even if you wanted it, I don't know how you would get it. Someone told me, oh, there's a dispensary in San Francisco and one in Oakland, and you could drive there, but it's like, you know, it was pointless. And by the time a dispensary opened right down the block from me, I could walk there. It's maybe 1,000 paces from my house right now. I'm speaking now from 2020. It's completely legal for recreational reasons, and I expected, you know, I haven't been in that shop, so I don't really know what they carry. I don't actually have any interest either, but it's just interesting that in the time just that I've been offering this class, the legislation has completely and utterly changed, and the attitude toward it has also. It's still, of course, illegal in the United States, federally, and someone could knock on your door, and if you were growing, you know, too many plants in your backyard or something, they could arrest you. But and it's a very interesting question. I mean, there's several questions here. One is the federal government law and the state law, how these two don't always jive. So where I'm sitting right now in the United States of America, marijuana is illegal. Where I'm sitting in California in Stockton, it is legal. So, you know, it's kind of crazy, but two rival jurisdictions say two completely different things. But the other side of this, and you know this is a whole theme in the course, is many drugs slip between medicinal and recreational back and forth and back and forth. Marijuana is the best example of this because it just a few years ago was medicinal, and it still is in some, you know, and obviously it has some therapeutic uses people really believe in, but it made that slip right before our eyes and now it's recreational. And people use it, and I think, now the big thing is the CBD oil and putting it in edibles and things. From what I hear, it has no effect really. It's a muscle relaxant, and it has therapeutic uses, but that's going to be a very big industry very soon nationally, because it is legal. CBD is legal, THC is not. So federally at least, so you can't sell it between states and things like that. So, but the other very interesting thing, and the point to point out, is that like very few other intoxicating substances, marijuana not only goes between medicinal and recreational, it goes from being completely illegal to completely legal, back and forth and back and forth. Almost nothing has done that. Absinthe sort of did it, was legal, then illegal, now it's legal again. But there are very few other things that make that add public attitudes change dramatically. I mean, when I was young, when I was in college in the 80s, the whole war on drugs, I went to school in Washington, D.C., so Ronald Reagan was a couple of blocks from where I lived. That whole war on drugs, I saw that firsthand. I mean, people, the attitude toward drugs, as a backlash to the 60s and 70s was vicious. And now, and in fact, even Jimmy Carter at one point, I remember in the 70s, wanted to make it legal. One term later, and there's a whole war on drugs. So let's start by talking. I'm going to go into some very old history, not current history as much, but obviously let's clarify what exactly marijuana is. Cannabis sativus and cannabis indica. There's two different varieties. The kind that has been mostly grown through history. And I think this has confused a lot of people in thinking that marijuana has always been around. But what's always been grown is hemp, right? It's the same cannabis. It's a species, it's a variety that is grown mostly for rope and for clothing. In fact, I've worn a hemp bracelet around my wrist for no reason whatsoever. I've had this on for 20 years, almost 30 years. I don't know. It's just always there. I can't tell you why. So hemp has been legal. George Washington did in fact grow hemp. He was not a pothead, but he grew hemp for rope. That was standard rope material, much more sustainable than. And the story is that it was killed by, I think it was Hearst. Hearst is the one who had an investments into the artificial fiber industry, what became polyester and stuff, which they make rope out of now as plastic, and decided that he would push for legislation against hemp, making it illegal. And that's the 30s. Now I'll come back to that story, but it just popped into my head, like, oh yeah, of course, that's why we don't have hemp so much anymore. But the thing about hemp, it's been grown for thousands of years. It has almost no psychoactive properties whatsoever. It can actually make you kind of nauseous if you smoke it. And and marijuana has been selected precisely for its mind-altering properties. You can't make rope out of marijuana. So I think in the popular press and in the pro-marijuana, lobbyists, they equate the two. They're not the same at all. They're the same species, but they're not the same thing. It's like the distance between a Great Dane and Chihuahua. You could say they're both dogs, but they don't behave the same way. They don't operate the same way at all. But according to the U.S. government, still, both the plant hemp and the marijuana are illegal federally. I don't know how they get around hemp seed, because you can buy that, and it's it's got lots of fiber in it, and it's supposed to be very good for you. And there are hemp products that are sold, have always been sold, obviously even clothes made of hemp. I'm not sure how they get around that, but let's start. But pot has a very fascinating history. It's been demonized, and of course, it was not illegal until the 1930s, and that happens almost everywhere in the world. It's a little bit after absinthe, but that's something that it's made illegal, despite the fact that it's still among the most widely used drugs on the planet. Apparently, after caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine, cannabis is right up there. And many people have argued that making it illegal and this is exactly like prohibition with alcohol, right? Is that making it illegal actually caused more crime in the long run because you ended up locking up people, and that tended to be largely people of color, and people of socioeconomic disadvantage got locked up more. And of course, it cost a fortune to lock those people up for minor drug dealing or possession. People had jail time for that. And it cost more in the long run and caused the crime, of course, because if you said this is not a crime, nothing would have happened. And you would have had to pay for those people or worry about them in prison. So the turn began around 2012 or so. It became legal in Colorado and Washington state to start with. And then, some states softened the laws just a little bit. Some made it okay for recreational use. California did that to start with. But again, the Federal Controlled Substance Act of 1970, it is still illegal in the U.S. and a federal troop can actually come in and destroy whatever they find growing in the country. So again, this is a bizarre contradiction of jurisdiction in marijuana. But the deeper question that I think we should start with, that I think bears some scrutiny before anything, is marijuana different than the other drugs we've discussed in the course? I mean, is the high somehow more intense? Is it more dangerous? Is it debilitating in any way? Is it habit forming? That's something that people have tried to answer and haven't quite yet, in a way that, tobacco is addictive. Is marijuana also? Does it pose a long-term threat to health that's actually maybe greater than alcohol or tobacco? And those studies have not been done, of course. And I'm inclined to think that in many ways it is different than many drugs that are legal now. So, for example, a few drinks does impair your ability to drive, but it doesn't quite make you stoned the same way marijuana does. And of course, the marijuana that's made now has an extraordinarily high rate, level of THC. I mean, the stuff that people were smoking when I was a kid in the 70s was maybe 2 to 3% THC, and then it's been bred up to 15%. I've been told that it could even be as high as 20% on average now. So and ironically, the weird thing that happened is that this happened precisely because of the war on drugs. I know this is going to sound totally bizarre and ironic, but before that, most marijuana was grown in Mexico. It was just illegal marijuana. Think of that. That's a Mary Jane. It's a Spanish word. Most of it was smuggled into the U.S. And when the United States government decided we're going to have a war on drugs, they paid the Mexican government to spread paraquat on the fields, which destroys it, makes it poisonous, and obviously you can't sell it after that, destroys the fields. And what it did is it made growers go underground, and breeders, and the whole development of hydroponic gardening, and it's really kind of interesting. The way the federal government searched for hydroponic gardens is they would use heat sensitivity photographing with helicopters, and if they found a house that was super hot, from the imprint, they would investigate. And I always thought, because I've got a kiln in my basement and fire it, and it gets, 130, 40 degrees down there when I'm firing. I don't shit, someone's going to come and try and arrest me, but that's never happened. But the point I'm making is that the really super cultivated hydroponics using halide or sodium lights, whatever that means, is very interesting. And of course, breeding, you use female plants. You don't want to plant something from seed, so you grow, you propagate them from buds and cuttings, so you don't have male and female offspring. You have to, you want stuff with sensimilla, without the seeds. So my point is, it's a different drug now. It's much stronger. It's also an odd drug because in my knowledge of this, my limited experience, is that it acts differently on different people. Some people it makes very stupid. Some people it makes paranoid. Others, it obviously there's a point where you laugh uncontrollably, and that's something that really doesn't happen with alcohol or any other drug that I know of. And it makes some people sort of pensive and philosophical. And then, and this part is completely scientifically verified, is the munchies, right? It sort of makes you, your heart rate speeds up, you get ravenous hunger, and this apparently causes because the metabolism of THC in the liver turns it into a slightly different drug that stimulates your appetite, and then you want to eat junk foods. So the whole idea that you'll lower your calories by not taking in so much alcohol by smoking pot instead is completely false, because you end up eating more candy and junk food as a result of this. But the truth of the matter is, and I've looked closely at this, is no one can scientifically explain what being high means. Okay, they can measure cognitive function and your ability to draw a straight line or walk do things like that. Measure motor skills. They can record your response times and reflexes, but there's no scientific understanding of really what it means to be high. And certainly all those measurements hardly capture the feeling and the creative energy that sometimes comes strangely from the experience. I think that the most interesting person to speak on this was Carl Sagan. And if you don't know Carl Sagan, he had a show on PBS when I was a little kid called Cosmos. It was brilliant. It was the first sort of popular explanation of astrophysics and the whole universe on TV. And I actually met Carl Sagan once, again, when I was living in Washington, D.C. I used to shop at the Watergate, and he was in there one day, and I said to him, he was buying eggs or something, and I said, "Shouldn't you be buying billions and billions?" And he turned to me and said, "No." And I said, "I." And he was a very nice person, but he used to say that all the time about stars, billions and billions. So I guess he'd heard that one before many, many times. In any case, Carl Sagan said this: "There is a myth about such highs that the user has an illusion of great insight, but it does not survive scrutiny in the morning." Meaning you say really brilliant things and you wake up in the morning and say, "I was just high, that was stupid." He thinks that's an error. "I am convinced that this is an error, and that the devastating insights achieved while high are real insights. The main problem is putting these insights into a form acceptable to the quite different self that we're talking about when we wake up the next day." So what he did is he started speaking when he was high and recording himself, and then listening into the next day and trying to figure out what he was actually saying. And he believed that it wasn't just BS, that he actually was seeing things. Well, think about what it does. We've been talking about this throughout the course, is that if you have a certain way of thinking, something that's distracting, like that sound of that car, or the way the light is flashing on the behind me every now and then, there's 1,000 stimuli. I hear children yelling now. My mind blocks those out because I'm trying to be efficient and focus on you. When you're high, you notice those things. Your mind doesn't quite work the same way, and you notice the beautiful lights that are above me, and then you can't see them. But things that would never occur to your mind to put together, suddenly you understand. And I think that's what Carl Sagan is trying to get at. I think also Michael Pollan, who's written, is mostly known for writing about food, which is why I know his work very well. But but he also writes about drugs, and in fact, his very latest book, I'll talk about it in the next lecture, where he talks about LSD. But he also wrote about marijuana in one of his earlier books, which I think is maybe his best. It's called The Botany of Desire. And what it does is it explains how various plants have gotten us to do their bidding by planting them around the world. Okay, and he says that cannabis actually is very, very smart as a chemical because it gets our brain to do certain things that our minds would do naturally. But this is much easier to make it happen. You just light up and it occurs. And these essentially do the opposite of what I was saying before, is that I was talking about noticing things and perception, but he says that in the long term it actually shears off the memory of things that you don't need, and it helps you forget the unimportant or painful things, and helps you to concentrate on the stuff that's really important and does have meaning that you might not even notice because you're so distracted with the daily minutia. That cannabis does the same thing our mind would do, but more efficiently. It helps us forget. Isn't that weird? Weird kind of insight. And this wasn't his personally. You know, he's a journalist. He got this from scientific studies that said that our minds do that. They erase things that are not important, so you can focus on the other stuff. But apparently, cannabis does this better. It helps us sharpen our sensory perceptions and live exactly in the moment. And I want you to focus on that point, because I'll be talking about it in this and the next lecture. Is that most of us are we're not riddled with anxiety necessarily, but we stop and we think about the past. We worry about what's going to happen next to the future. And that kind of conditions our moving through reality. We always have, the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, or the past regret, or the past memory that's positive. In other words, we very rarely live right in the moment, right in this very second, and say, don't worry about the future, don't think about the past because it's gone. And apparently this cannabis helps you to do that. And helps you live in the moment without the baggage of the past and future. And again, I'm speaking through other people's perception, not my own directly. But let's focus for the remainder of what this talk on the pendulum swings of tolerance and criminalization. Why does it go back and forth so dramatically, more so than any other drug I can think of? And why is it that in the early 20th century, and this is when marijuana first really became popular in the United States, it was at first tolerated and it was legal and people even spoke about it. It was not, and there were other drugs that were legal at the time. They put cocaine in Coca-Cola, and there were opiates in your Vin Mariani and things like that. But marijuana was among these things, and no one thought twice about it, really. Well, they thought twice about it, but it was legal. Why was it that in the late 30s there was a backlash for several decades, all the way through World War II, and you could argue up into the 50s? And then in the 60s and 70s, it has this amazing, intense revival. Culturally, it fits that period of hippies and, tie-dyes and so forth. And then there was this amazing backlash in the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s that made it culturally not unacceptable, but obviously illegal also. And it just didn't fit, really. The 80s and 90s, my experience of the 80s was cocaine when I was in college, was the drug of choice. People who smoked pot were just seen as lazy hippies. They weren't out dancing in the clubs and doing things like that. So, and then of course, in the past, from 2010, the past decade really, we've seen a remarkable tolerance. So I want you to just keep that in mind as we talk about the 20th century, because it's not like this tolerance is a very recent thing, that all of a sudden people said, let's make it legal, and that's only been the present. It has been a total pendulum swing back and forth for a long, long time. So let's start with the background history, because of all the drugs we've spoken about in this course, cannabis has the longest recorded history, the longest surviving archaeological evidence of its usage, older than alcohol, I think. And the reason for this is primarily because cannabis does not take any processing, right? You can actually just dry it and ingest it. You can smoke it. You can, it's not like you have to make the alcohol from it. There are a few others. Mushrooms, I guess, don't take any processing either, but this doesn't have those serious side effects. And you can use any part of the plant as well. It's almost always buds and and sometimes leaves too, but we don't. But you can use the stems also have THC in them, and it is definitely. I want you to think back all the way to the beginning of the course. It is among the entheogens that we discussed at the very beginning. Cultures have used it as a way of bringing the god into them, of experiencing travel through time and space, going to the other realm, communicating with the ancestors. Think of all those things we discussed that are considered entheogens. And let's talk about some of these cultures. So, cannabis indigenous to Eurasia. And so the ancient Hindu texts, the Atharva Vedas, mention cannabis as among the 5 sacred plants, which presumably it's in great long-term usage by that point. This is 2000 BC, so a very long time ago. And in India and Nepal, it was consumed in several different ways. So let me just describe these 3 different forms. One is called bhang, Bhang, which is the leaves which are made into a kind of tea and then drunk. Okay, so you get some of the, I don't think cannabis is very water soluble, so I think they must put fat in there too. Now that I'm thinking about this, and there may very well be, but in any case, it's something you drink a drinkable form. The other is ganja. You wonder where that word comes from. It's there. The leaves and the buds are smoked. And lastly, there's something else called hashish, which is the resin which is extracted from the buds, and you also smoke that, but it's dark and fudge-like. It's oily and greasy. It's the resin taken from the plant. And some of these forms, bhang especially, is actually sacred to Shiva, and it's used as an offering. So remember, we've been talking about intoxicating things not just consumed but offered to gods or ancestors, and cannabis is one of them. The sadhus use bhang as an aid to spiritual enlightenment. It's been said that the Sufis among the Muslim, they're a Muslim sect that believes in ecstatic worship of God, and remember, you can't drink alcohol in Islam, so they use it also apparently. And there is a festival called Holi, Holi, where it's used as a kind of milk fudge, a halwa. It's sort of a fudge-like consistency of candy that is infused in the cannabis is infused in ghee. So if you're wondering, let me explain what this is. Ghee is clarified butter, basically, but you cook it off so that the milk solids will precipitate and fall at the bottom. The water all cooks off, and then you pour the clear, clarified butter off of the top. And the advantage of this in India is it doesn't go bad. You can keep it at room temperature. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't have the stuff that goes bad in butter. But that is pure fat, so THC is soluble in the ghee. So you mix that into the ghee, and then you add fruits and milk and other things, and then you make a kind of fudge out of it, which you just obviously an edible, right? And you put that in pastries. You can put it in a samosa, a little fried pastry, or pakoras, things like that. And most importantly, you just roll the fat in with fruit into a little ball. Okay, this is a kind of we'll talk about hashish fudge later, but it's there, in ancient times, essentially just fruit rolled with fat and little ball saturated with THC. So the ancient Chinese also used cannabis. It's among the earliest plants to be domesticated, which is kind of not surprising. Used for rope, and we know this because obviously a rope is not going to last in a historical in an archaeological dig. But we know this because when you take a pot, and often they are decorated by taking a rope, coiling it around the pot, and impressing it, so you have these very interesting lines going around, but apparently they can tell that those lines are made by hemp rope, going around, and the pottery is indestructible. Shards of that last forever. So the Yanghai tombs in the western Uyghur region of China, there is a 2,700-year-old grave of a shaman who was buried with this big leather basket of remarkably well-preserved cannabis, presumably used for divination. the Chinese pharmacopoeia, which is the oldest and the most extensive on Earth, includes the text of Shen Nung, who's the one of the second celestial emperor, writer of medicinal texts that are part of traditional Chinese medicine, supposed to date back to 2727 BC, and he talks about the use of cannabis. So it's there, as old as anything recorded on Earth, really. He says that if you take too much of this, you will throw yourself around and behave like a maniac. But taken moderately over a long time, you will come to communicate with the spirits. And it's interesting that he mentions a long time, because presumably you build up a certain tolerance over time. I think that's probably why marijuana's never agreed with me. I've never had the patience to keep doing it. It hits me very, very hard, even a little bit. So you do build up a tolerance, and I think that may be what he's referring to there. And the ancient Taoists supposedly were looking for longevity medicine. Taoism is the third major religious philosophical tradition in China. There's Confucianism. Buddhism comes much later, but Taoism is an indigenous system of philosophy and religion, part of which actually looks for longevity drugs, and apparently marijuana was one of these. They would sit in a big hut, light them like incense sticks, basically, which they still do in temples, incidentally, in China. If you ever go into a Chinese temple, there's just incense sticks hanging from the ceiling and all over the place, and you breathe in the smoke, and that's the communication to the ancestors. But if you do it with pot, you get very stoned. So that is, apparently they would put this in their temples and light it and breathe in the smoke. So, and cannabis, I've heard accounts, and I don't know if this is true, but that it might actually even be mentioned in the Old Testament. The word kane means fragrant, kane bosum, I assume Hebrew, means fragrant reed, yes, Hebrew, and it shows up in Isaiah 43:24. It shows up in Exodus 30:23, where they take this stuff, they mix it with an oil that's used for anointment. The ancient people used to rub oil in their temples and their beards with scented things. Maybe I'll do that with my hippie gown here. So, and they did that with myrrh, with cassia, with cinnamon, and with this kane bosum, which might be cannabis, in which case it's kind of like Jimi Hendrix, putting the heroin into his headband and letting it soak into his forehead while he's doing it. I guess it might do it, but in any case, there has been a whole lot of speculation as a result of this, that the original oil that's used to anoint kings, and pay attention to this, the word is the word Moshiach, the Messiah in Hebrew and then in Greek, means anointed. The chrism, which is the oil that they would anoint the Messiah, and they did anoint kings with, may have originally included some kind of hash. So it's a kind of hash oil that they're putting in, and maybe soaks into your skin. So if you look into the pro-cannabis literature, they'll say, yeah, Jesus was a stoner man. He's long hair and hung around with his buddies and got. I could be nonsense, but if that word kane bosum means marijuana, then it's in there. The more interesting culture, I think, are the ancient Scythians. Now let's talk about the Scythians. Were a semi-nomadic group that lived in the Eurasian steppes, but they came in contact with the Greeks, and the ancient historian Herodotus knew about the Scythians, and he says that these people would go into a tent, they bring some hot rocks from the fire into the middle of the tent, and then they throw the leaves on this and fill the whole tent with smoke. And I'll quote here, so you can hear, until they rise up to dance and betake themselves to singing. They make a booth by fixing in the ground 3 sticks inclined toward one another, stretching around them wooden felts, which they arrange so as to fit as close as possible. Inside the booth, a dish is placed on the ground, in which they put a number of hot red stones. Then they add some hemp seed, and the Scythians, as I said, take some of this hemp seed creeping under the tent coverings, throw it upon the red hot stones. Immediately it smokes, It gives out a vapor as no Grecian vapor bath can exceed, and the scythes, delighted, start to shout for joy, and this vapor serves them instead of a water bath, for they never by any chance wash their bodies with water. Now, Herodotus gets this completely, I mean, he doesn't get it wrong, but he doesn't understand what's going on here. They're clearly doing this to get stoned, not that the smoke doesn't clean you. I mean, maybe it fumigates from bugs. I don't know what he's thinking, but he got it in his head that they don't ever bathe. They smoke themselves instead, which is hilarious. But the more amazing thing is the size. There's archaeological evidence of these people. And in 1993, the body of a Pazyryk, which is a Scythian woman who had blonde hair, this is really strange, was discovered. They called her the Russians called her the Siberian Ice Maiden, because this was part of Siberia where they found her. She was believed to be a high priestess in the Altai Mountains. That's right in that region where China, Mongolia, and Russia meet. You know, it's all the way up. It's Siberia, and she was frozen solid in ice for 2,400 years. She had on a beautiful white blouse that was made of hemp, so we know they're growing that. She had these gorgeous tattoos of deer on her arms. Stop and look for the Siberian Ice Maiden. They're astonishing, beautiful tattoos on her whole body. She was accompanied by 3 sacrificed horses, and with her was there a box of cannabis. So now I've heard other accounts that say no, it was coriander that was dried. But in Scythian tombs, you often find censers with cannabis seeds, the frames for the inhalation tents. So Herodotus was, it seems, right. Okay, but more fascinatingly, there's this woman who was discovered with the stuff buried with her. So it seems the Scythians get the biggest claim for the earliest stoner culture. Among the ancient Germanic tribes also, cannabis was apparently sacred to the love goddess Freya. She was a Norse goddess. Now, does her name sound familiar to you? Freya? You know, a lot of the days of the week are named after Norse goddesses. So Freya is for Friday. She's the goddess of Friday and pot. So if you think Friday is a good day. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying. Wotan is, Wednesday, Thor is Thursday. So Freya is for Friday. And apparently the Germans would ingest, the Germanic people, I mean, they're not the Germans yet, were ingesting the flowers which contained the goddess's power of fertility. So this gave you some great sexual power. Accounts I've heard say the opposite, but apparently they thought they did it. And let's talk about the fascinating historical etymology here, because that's what's really fascinating to me. The word hemp comes from the Germanic word hennep, which comes from the Proto-Germanic word. I don't know how they reconstruct this stuff, but here it is. The word hanapes, which comes right from the Scythian word cannabis, and the Greeks got that word cannabis directly from the Scythians. So weirdly, the word hemp is the same word as cannabis. I know that's a long, tortured etymological genealogy, but that's what they say. And the other word, and I found this out just recently, which is what I was writing there in just a second ago, is the word canvas, is a version of the word cannabis. That comes right from the Latin, because that's what they make canvases out of. So when you think of painters and art and canvases, that's a weird connection etymologically. That's interesting. So Greeks and Romans, they definitely also knew about cannabis. They used it as medicine. They were probably using the same variety they used as rope, so who knows how much impact it actually had. But the first century botanist, the great botanist Dioscorides, mentions that cannabis was used to suppress earaches. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, said that if you boil the roots in water, it's good for easing cramped joints and for curing gout. So they had definite medicinal uses for it. Whether it's what we would consider something that has medical efficaciousness, I don't know, but they believed it did. And Galen, who was the greatest medical writer of the ancient world, physician to several Roman emperors like Marcus Aurelius, he said that a kind of hemp seed cake that uses the tops of the plants also, he says that if you overindulgence in this, it causes warmness and a toxic vapor that will rise into the head, and I think what he's describing is the dizziness and the high that comes from using it. But I have to say, in Greek medicine, it's fairly marginal in that culture. I mean, they knew the plant, they had a couple of medicinal uses for it, but there's no record of it ever being used recreationally. Even though we know that they definitely did use other drugs, they obviously used wine also, but there's no sense that they knew it would make you happy and relaxed. And that leads me to believe that what they're actually talking about is hemp, that it's really not the cannabis that we know today. In the Middle Ages, they know a little more about it. Cannabis, they get it from through Asian civilizations, and the more the widespread story supposedly comes from Marco Polo, in that he told of this person, Hassan ibn Sabah, who was a murderous gang leader in medieval Persia, who would take his recruits, get them completely high and passed out by giving them hashish, and then put them in this beautiful garden with incense and perfumes and beautiful women like the houris, something like paradise, all around them. But there were also heads covered in blood sitting around. These were supposedly, in the story he tells, actors, which suggested to them that if they wanted to return to paradise, they would have to be willing to kill without discrimination and murderously. And this supposedly made them fearless in committing crimes, and so they would take the hashish and go out and become assassins. The word assassin and hashish supposedly having some direct connection. And this story, actually, as we'll see, becomes widespread in the early 20th century in the campaign against pot. People have their doubts about whether it really happened, but people believed it, and that's just as important. Now, worthy of mention, let me mention just one of my favorite authors. I think before we get to the modern era, is let's call it the Renaissance rediscovery of pot. And I talk about this because there's an author, Bartolomeo Platina is the name he usually goes by because he's from Piadna, who worked as a papal historian. He was the first librarian of the Vatican Library. He also wrote, or stole actually, what was the first printed cookbook, kind of interestingly, called De Honesta Voluptate, which means on honest pleasure. It's kind of a mix of these recipes he borrowed from this guy Martino and mixed with medical advice and natural history and other stuff. Fascinatingly wonderful book, and of course it's one of those things that I've studied directly. But the book was published in 1470, and it actually has a couple of cannabis recipes, believe it or not. There is one Cibarium Cannabinum for 12 people. That means cannabis food. That says to take a pound of pot cooked, add a pound of almonds beaten with breadcrumbs, put it in a mortar, moisten this with stock, pass it through a sieve, and that's kind of standard medieval cooking technology there. And then to this is added a pound of sugar, which is still pretty expensive and rare in the 1470s, half an ounce of ginger, saffron, rose water, and serve it sprinkled with sweet spices. So I want you to think of this as a kind of thick, sweet, aromatic, maybe not a pudding, maybe like a kind of fudge. I assume it's kind of thick at this point. And maybe, and if it is actually cannabis rather than a low-grade hemp, the oil in the almonds would make a very, good carrier of the THC, and the, the sweetness and the spices are gonna, stave off the munchies before they set in, I guess, at some level. But interestingly, this looks kind of like the very ancient, balls of marijuana wrapped up with fruits and spices and things, and sweetened. So, any case, and you will read, in the pro-pot literature, and even in what is sometimes meant to pass for serious scholarship, that Pope Innocent VIII in 1484 condemned marijuana for being the anti-sacrament that was used in the worship of the devil, and in the papal bull called Summis Desiderantes, the most desired, the height, the sum of what is desired. Apparently he condemns marijuana. Okay, and you'll read this all over the place. There is such a bull. I looked at it very closely in English, and I didn't see any mention of marijuana. I went to the original Latin version and read that as closely as I could. There is no mention of pot in there. It's just, this is made up. It's also said that the physicians of the era identified cannabis as the drug that witches used in their ointments and tinctures and used in potions. But it's just not true. The cannabis is mentioned in the medical literature through the Greeks. They mention a couple of things. There's maybe some novelties. Platina, of course, has this kind of sweet, spicy fudge, but there is nothing in that papal bull that talks about condemning marijuana, and it's again marginal, really, in the medical literature. Just to give you an example of this, this is Pier Andrea Mattioli in the 16th century. He says cannabis is, of course, well known to all Europeans. He says it's not very good in food, but for chickens it makes them lay many eggs. And there's nothing here about getting high. So I think he's still talking really about hemp and hemp seed, not marijuana with high THC level. Another thing you will always read is that marijuana was grown by George Washington. He was a pot farmer. Absolutely not. He grew hemp. He was a distiller of whiskey. We know that for a fact. And he wasn't above selling things that would make you tipsy, but he did not grow pot. And so let's look at marijuana. Let's move to the present. The kind that gets introduced to the U.S. definitely comes first from marijuana. We adopted the Spanish term for it for that reason, and I think the great revolutionary ditty La Cucaracha. Let me give you some of the lyrics from the 1910 version. This is when marijuana first comes to the United States, as does this song, La Cucaracha, you know the song, Yo no puede caminar, he can't walk anymore, porque la falta, porque no tiene marijuana pa fumar, meaning he's lacking, what's missing is because he doesn't have any marijuana to smoke. Why they sanitize that poor song? It's hilarious. The cockroaches. Anyway, that's when marijuana first comes in. But its real heyday, and I think this is surprising to many people, is not it is the 60s and 70s, but the jazz era is all about marijuana. And its association starts right at the very beginning of jazz. It starts in New Orleans. It starts with Louis Armstrong, who was... Look at Louis Armstrong. Stop and watch anything that he does. You will see that his eyes are glassy and bloodshot, that he's smiling very happily, and it was a kind of dopey thing he got, because he had a big mouth. They used to call him Satchel Mouth. But just look at him and think, is this guy high? And he said it himself. So this is New Orleans around the turn of the century. New Orleans, Louis Armstrong is talking about that time period. He said, we always looked at pot as a kind of medicine, a cheap drunk, and with much better thoughts than when one's head is full of liquor. And here's the strange thing, that I can definitely confirm this. Do an experiment yourself if you want. have a few drinks. And if you play an instrument, I play the piano mostly, watch what happens to your fingers. Suddenly you lose motor coordination, your hands get sloppy, you slide among the keys, you start to, you slur your words a little if you drink enough, but even one drink will begin to immediately impair your motor skills. Try it with marijuana. It doesn't at all. You can play, apparently. I think this is why people, for some stupid reason, think you can drive while stoned. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's a very bad idea, but you can play. I've tried it a few times, and I think it's true. And jazz musicians did it because it would not slow them down, and because it was cheaper, and what they called it at the time, marijuana is one name, the other is muggles. And I know that sounds kind of funny because we have a completely different idea of what a muggle is from Harry Potter and stuff, but muggles is the word for it, or reefer, we still have that word around. But they are especially associated with jazz musicians, and to start, for at least the first 23 years of the 20th century, jazz and marijuana are completely associated, to such an extent that Louisiana had to ban it in 1923. That's when they do. And apparently Armstrong said he went on smoking it anyway. And in fact, he was thrown in jail when he was on a gig in Los Angeles. He was smoking, and they locked him up for it. And supposedly he claimed that it was a rival band leader planted some pot on him. But you listen to him later, and he says, yes, we smoke all the time. And apparently what happened is the judge in this court trial was apparently a fan, and he let him go. He said, no, don't worry about it. And this is what Louis Armstrong had to say. So I went to work that night, and I wailed on just like nothing happened. He was stoned and continued to play his trumpet. What struck me funny, though, I laughed real loud when several movie stars came up to the bandstand while we played a dance set and told me when they heard me getting caught with marijuana, they thought it was Mary Warner, some chick. Woo boy, that really fractured me, meaning he thought it was hilarious. They didn't know Mary Warner was. And in fact, in 1928, Armstrong wrote a piano piece called Muggles. I think he co-wrote that with Earl Hines. Earl Father Hines was the co-author. But anyway, the Muggles. So he was doing it and writing songs about it also. And pot was the drug of choice into the later jazz era. What they would call someone who smoked is a viper. That use has gone completely out of usage. But I want you to think of what would happen if you went. The sound is like a snake. It's being a viper. So that's a nickname for someone who smokes pot. And there's a song called "If You're a Viper," written by Snuff Smith, that was made popular by Fats Waller. And now you have to stop now. Listen to Fats Waller. He sings, "I dreamed about a reefer 5 foot long, mighty mez, but not too strong. You'll be high, but not for long, if you're a viper." And he just does the sound, and he was a great musician. The mez apparently refers to Milton Mesro, who was a dealer, a Jewish dealer, who took up the sax and eventually became a musician, and so mez became a byword for pot, for buying the pot. And the song was written in brazen defiance of the people who were trying to get pot outlawed nationally. This is Anslinger, who I'll talk about in a second. But let me give you just a couple more lyrics, and then I want you to listen to it. So, think about a reptile 5 foot long, a little bit high but not too strong. You'll be high but not for long if you're a viper. Well, now I'm the king of everything. Got to get high before I sing. Sky is high, everybody's high if you're a viper. If your throat gets dry, you know you're high. You know that cotton mouth feeling. Everything is dandy. Truck on down to the candy store. Bust your conch on some peppermint candy. Now you know your body's scent. You don't give a damn if you don't pay rent. Light that tea, let it be if you're a viper. So listen to Fats Waller doing If You're a Viper. The other song I'd like you to listen to is Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway was hilarious also. He danced around, had this enormous bush of hair, and he did what was called the Reefer Man in 1932. And I'll read you the lyrics, and I want you to listen to this one also. Man, what's the matter with that cat there? Must be full of reefer. Full of reefer? Yes, man, you mean that cat's high, sailing lightly, get away from here. Man, is that the reefer man? That's the reefer man. And Cab Calloway is just an astoundingly incredible performer. So listen to that. That's 1932. Cab Calloway, the reefer man. Listen now. Okay. So, through the 1930s, there was broad tolerance. And this extends, I think, maybe not as popular, but people were still doing it into the 50s. In fact, in Alice B. Toklas, the recipe published in 1954, supposedly took place in the 30s. Remember, Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein, the great poet, were living together in Paris in the 30s when Hemingway would drop by for a drink. Of course, he always drank. And, great artists, Picasso's there at the time. Great, cultural time. But Alice B. Toklas wrote this recipe for hashish fudge, which supposedly Alice did make it, and it was a joke. And apparently it tasted awful. So I don't think Gertrude Stein even ate the stuff. But what is weird is that it was published in the 50s. And from that point on, hashish fudge and Alice B. Toklas are associated directly. Okay? And people apparently made the recipe and ate it. And I don't know. But it becomes infamous. So infamous, in fact, that there's a great movie. It was funny. When I was kind of revising this lecture a couple of years ago, and I heard of this movie with Peter Sellers. Remember Peter Sellers from the Pink Panther, who did a movie called I Love You, Alice B. Toklas, and I thought, I must know what this movie is about. It's hilarious. It's about this completely ordinary guy who decides he hates his job, hates life, and hooks up with this young hippie girl, and they and what happens is she is making brownies and decides that the parents are really square, and so she dumps the pot into the brownies, and everyone eats them, and they're very happy. Suddenly they all get along, and then all these hippies show up in their house, and it's a hilariously funny, weird movie. I think made in the late 60s or early 70s or something like that. But the point is, Alice B. Toklas is associated with these hash brownies. And let me read you why it was so famous. It's because she's funny. She's a really good writer. So she's talking about hashish fudge. This is the food of paradise, of Baudelaire's artificial paradises. Think back to when we were talking about Baudelaire in the Absinthe lecture. It might provide entertaining refreshment for a ladies' bridge club or a chapter meeting of the DAR. The DAR is the Daughters of the American Revolution, this ultra-conservative, stuffy old ladies club for people who are descended from colonial people. So she says, in Morocco, it's thought to be good for warding off the common cold in damp weather and is, indeed, more effective if taken with large quantities of hot mint tea. Euphoria, brilliant storms of laughter, ecstatic revelries, and the sound of cars, extension of one's personality on several simultaneous planes are complacently expected. Almost anything Saint Teresa did you can do better to be ravished by an évanouissement rêvé. That means a fainting dream. And what she's referring to there is the great statue by Bernini, in which Saint Teresa is fainting as an angel plunges a flaming arrow into her heart, and she has this orgasmic experience. So Alice B. Toklas is saying, you eat this hashish fudge, that's how you're going to end up. It's hilarious, and I have to read you the recipe too. You'll see why in a second. Take 1 teaspoon black peppercorns, 1 whole nutmeg, 4 average sticks of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon coriander. These should be pulverized in a mortar. About a handful each of de-stoned dates, means take the pits out, dried figs, shelled almonds, and peanuts. Chop these, mix them together. A bunch of cannabis sativa can be pulverized. Along with this, the spices should be dusted over the mixed fruit and nuts, kneaded together. About a cup of sugar dissolved in a big pat of butter, rolled into a cake and cut into pieces or made into balls about the size of a walnut. It should be eaten with care. 2 pieces are quite sufficient. Obviously, she's talking about something very much like Platina's balls of cannabis and like the prehistoric one that we started the lecture with, right? This is nuts and fruits and spices mixed up with cannabis leaves, and you eat them directly. The fat is the carrier. She says, obtaining the cannabis may present certain difficulties, but the variety known as cannabis sativa grows as a common weed, often unrecognized everywhere in Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. Besides being cultivated as a crop for the manufacture of rope in the Americas, while often discouraged, its cousin, cannabis indica, has been observed in many city window boxes. I don't know whether that's true. It should be picked and dried as soon as it's gone to seed and while the plant is still green. Kind of fascinating. So this early enthusiasm was squashed for a couple of reasons. By the 40s and 50s, and this idea of what was called reefer madness. Now I want you to keep that word in your mind. There was a film in 1936 that told the story of a high school where the students all start to smoke pot and they end up committing murder, killing themselves, raping, descending into insanity. Now I want you to stop right now and look at the trailer for the movie Reefer Madness. And look at the idiotic, maniacal faces on the people in the trailer. Just watch the trailer. If you could see the whole movie and you really want to, go ahead. I've never had the patience to sit through the whole thing because it's totally propaganda nonsense. But the trailer is hilariously funny. It's total camp now. We look at it and laugh. But please watch that and come back in a second. So, the association forged in the film, and of course by the US government, is that pot led to violence. I can't imagine anything more untrue. Obviously, pot leads to being peaceful. In fact, the funniest thing is I once went to a Dead concert and was stoned just by association. All the people there smoking and spinning around, and it was a big crowded arena. And I've never seen people more patient and calm getting out of the place. Everyone was just kind of walking and talking to each other and being happy, and the pot really made everyone. And it was, and Jerry was still alive. I'm pretty sure he was there, and so it was just kind of like this. In fact, I went to the service for Jerry Garcia in San Francisco right after he died. It was in Golden Gate Park. There were women with topless and everyone smoking. It was a very strange experience. But in any case, my point is that it's the drug that makes you the most mellow and peaceful, as we all know. It's anything but makes you violent. I mean, if a drug that makes you violent, cocaine maybe does, because it's an upper and makes you jittery. Pot does exactly the opposite. But the government convinced people that it would make you mad and lead to violence. And that's when the story of the assassins was recirculated by Harry Anslinger, who was the director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who really kind of single-handedly got marijuana criminalized in 1937. And if you like, go online, Google vintage anti-marijuana posters, and just look at some of the stuff that they pulled in these posters, making you think that you were going to go crazy and lose your mind and kill people from smoking. And here's the story, of course, that I mentioned before. The chemical company DuPont, which owns Delaware and goes all the way back to Alphonse Irénée DuPont in the 18th century, but it's the largest chemical company. And William Hearst financed an anti-marijuana campaign because the hemp was a threat to their new synthetic rope products. And Hearst, of course, owned all the newspapers, so he had this smear campaign with stories like this one. Let me give you an idea. An entire family was murdered by a youthful addict in Florida. When the officers arrived at the home, they found the youth staggering about in this human slaughterhouse. With an axe, he'd killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and a sister, and he seemed to be in a daze. He had no recollection of having committed the multiple crime. The officers knew him ordinarily as a sane, rather quiet young man, but now he was pitifully crazed, and they sought the reason. The boy said that he'd been in the habit of smoking something which his friends called muggles, which was a childish name for marijuana. And Anslinger just made the connection between violence and marijuana more explicit because he said everything implied that it had to do with jazz, it had to do with African Americans, and there was a decidedly racist association. The idea was that, this was very raucous kind of music that degenerates and African American people listened to, and if you let your daughter listen to this, she's going to end up with these people. It's totally racist. Okay, I'm not pretending it's anything but that. And I think a very common kind of connection was in the 60s and 70s. People looked at psychedelic rock and long hair and hippies, and it was very much a kind of misunderstanding of children or young adults who were listening to a different kind of music that their parents just didn't get, but also this fear that was put in their heads that they were going to become addicts and dropouts and criminals. And of course, there's a streak of racism that runs through these cultural classes because jazz, historically, of course, had roots in the African American community, as did rock and roll. And the association was made kind of explicit, by these, by the fear somehow that not only the drug, but the music itself was going to corrupt the youths. Let me read you a headline which ran in the 30s campaign against marijuana. And you'll understand what's happening here. Colored students at the University of Minnesota partying with white female students, smoking marijuana and getting their sympathy with stories of racial persecution. Result, pregnancy. I mean, they got away with printing this shit. This is another one. 2 Negroes took a girl 14 years old and kept her for 2 days under the influence of hemp. Upon recovery, she was found to be suffering from syphilis. So this is the way they just sort of struck fear in people's minds, that said, we have to make it illegal, we have to crack down on it. And it worked. And that whole generation was terrified of it and, frightened by this reefer madness. That's the idea. The pendulum swung back, though. And how this happened is just as interesting. It doesn't really happen until the 60s. And, within a decade, gosh, by the 70s, as I said, it was on the verge of social acceptance. It was something that people could joke about on TV. Respectable adults smoked it. It wasn't just hippies. And as I said, President Carter at the time suggested decriminalizing it in seriousness. Okay, so that's a good measure of social acceptability. But let me mention the ways that it came in. Remember that Rastafarian culture glorifies the use of marijuana because its diet is both vegetarian and forbids alcohol, but it doesn't say anything about marijuana. So now think back all the way to the Old Testament, to the Nazirites. Remember, not Nazarenes, but Nazirites, who made a special vow to God not to consume alcohol and not to cut their hair. Well, that's where Haile Selassie, that's where the Rastafarian, the Lion of Judah, that's where the Rastafarians got this idea. And I want you to listen, if you like to, Bob Marley's Kaya, which is 1978. But Bob Marley, openly smoked marijuana, and it explains, of course, that coffee shop in Amsterdam that I went to, which was entirely Bob Marley-esque. And then there's Bob Dylan. Listen to what's called Rainy Day Women number 12 and 35. That's 1966. But basically it says everybody must get stoned. It's a raucous kind of thing where trombones come in and tambourines, and it's just a big jam in. But apparently Bob Dylan met the Beatles in 1964 on their New York tour, and he apparently turned them on to pot. And they it was kind of a strange situation because they handed one to Ringo. He didn't realize the social conventions that dictated that you take a hit and then you pass it around and it goes to everyone and it's shared communally. He apparently took it and smoked the whole thing, not understanding, because Ringo's a little, okay. And then by the time they recorded Help, John Lennon said this: "The Beatles had gone beyond all comprehension. We were smoking marijuana for breakfast. We were well into marijuana and no one could even communicate with us because we were there glazed eyes giggling all the time." And Lennon was actually caught with just a half an ounce of cannabis resin and was actually convicted. Paul McCartney apparently never kicked the habit. He was convicted 4 times, the last of which he was in his 40s. So it's, it's kind of, if you like the Beatles and listen to them, this is before the heavier, the LSD and heavier drugs, but the early stuff, Revolver, is totally recorded stoned. The Rolling Stones, of course, also got in serious trouble when their house was raided in 1967, and they found Marianne Faithfull naked and stoned, hiding under a rug. I mean, I'm just trying to picture this whole. I was a very young kid at the, when all this happened, but I kind of got a sense of what the culture was like, because I remember my neighbors across the street, the Alexanders, were hippies and used to hang out on the roof and smoke pot, and one of them used to babysit for me. So I got this kind of, growing up when I was still a kid, but I kind of understood what was happening. We used to watch Laugh-In on TV. Oh my God, look at Goldie Hawn sometime. and the jokes that Rowan and Martin did this show called Laugh-In, and they used to joke about pot all the time. So this was part of my growing up. I understood what was going on to some extent, and certainly in the music. Listen to Neil Young. This is Roll Another Number for the Road he's talking about. This is, what happened there. And let me talk about this in a little more detail. Neil, this is 1975, but it is post the point where the whole hippie generation, the Summer of Love, comes to an end, which is 1969. And I mention it because it happens in the Altamont. If you're heading towards San Francisco from Stockton, you go over the Altamont. There's a raceway back there where there was a concert in which the Stones, if I get this right, I think hired the Hells Angels to be their security guards. Don't ask me why they did this. And they ended up beating up and killing a few people in the course of the concert. And apparently the Altamont, 1969, was supposed to be like Woodstock on the West Coast. Santana was there, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Jefferson Airplane, the Stones, the Dead were there also, and they apparently never got to play. And someone drowned in a ditch, and so that's kind of like the signal end of an era. The hippie era comes to an end. Of course, it didn't at all. The 70s changed in many ways, and we'll move on to some other more interesting drugs artistically we'll talk about later. But again, my point is that as a cultural phenomenon, attitudes toward pot tend to go in very clear and distinct cycles. In the hippie era is replaced by the yuppie era, right? Young, upper middle class professional, or as upwardly mobile professional yuppies rejected hippie culture entirely. This is the Reagan era. This is the war on drugs, topsiders, these little sort of leather shoes, wearing polo shirts and khaki pants, and having short hair, and wearing thick glasses and being Republican. That's what came into fashion. This is right when I got to college. That was the yuppie era. And the penalties became very stiff for a minimum of 5 years in prison for cultivation of 2 kilograms or more. In Oklahoma, the penalty for growing any amount of pot was a life sentence in jail. And they really did throw people in jail forever for doing this. A whole variety of constitutional principles were eventually violated in the war on drugs. You could search without warrant, you could destroy someone's property without a trial. I mean, all sorts of things happened. And those laws really are all, it's really only the past decade or so that they've begun to be dismantled, and the prison sentences disappeared, and the understanding the essentially racist nature of those laws also, and I think the the tolerance that has grown has been kind of extraordinary. Really, I think it's just sort of amazing that in the time that I've been doing this class, it's now legal. I could now, if I want, just for kicks, walk right onto the other side of the park, under the freeway to the dispensary, and buy some pot, and I could smoke it right here in front of you. That was not really a reefer that I pulled out before, incidentally. That was a cigarette, tobacco, and I'm not smoking it. But the just stop and think about the attitudes, how they've changed, and how the arts, the culture, the entire sort of zeitgeist, that means the feelings of the time, the spirit of the times, has changed with the political change, with the attitudes toward drug, with the music that's changed. And so next time I'm gonna pick up. I don't think I ever recorded this lecture, so I'll do it again and post it soon. But that will be about LSD, which follows right on the heels of pot and the whole psychedelic era, which I'm going to talk about a whole lot. Maybe I'll wear my tie-dye again, but I don't know. And then we'll talk about heroin, we'll talk about cocaine, barbiturates, some really nasty stuff. And I'm going to end before the present in the course. I think that probably will be the last lecture, and maybe if I have time, I'll add something else. I don't really want to talk about opioid epidemic and that sort of thing, but maybe I will. But if not, there'll be at least one more lecture after this on LSD and cocaine and other fun things. So until next time, I'll see you next time.